like us to include, not in the recording. When you have questions, please let us know. All right, so with that, I want to give an introduction to our privacy legislation series. In this Privacy Legislation 101 series, we are exploring specific legislative aspects of comprehensive privacy laws in an effort to provide US lawmakers and other policy experts with the resources and tools needed to be prepared to evaluate the range of federal and state efforts in 2020 and beyond. Our goal is to provide independent expertise, practical resources, and perspectives from advocacy groups, industry, and academic scholars. Let's dive into our webinar agenda for today. Our goal is to provide a background on existing child privacy legal regimes. We'll go over potential risks and harms that policymakers are trying to mitigate or prevent, the traditional and emerging US approach to child privacy, discuss some international approaches that may spill over into US policy, and share high-level trends and considerations for drafting legislation, including potential unintended consequences to watch out for. We'll then have about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. Please feel free to enter your questions in chat throughout the presentation, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end. So why are we talking about child privacy protections? The major focus federally and in states is on creating consumer privacy legislation broadly. So first and foremost, practically, many consumer privacy laws and proposals, from California's Consumer Privacy Act to Senator Wicker's recent bill, have included additional protections for children. We all know that children are especially vulnerable and deserving of special protection above and beyond the protections given to adult consumers. But I think it is valuable to briefly explore why. So there are three major ways that children generally differ from your average adult consumer. So their brains are not fully developed, and they are often not fully able to weigh the benefits and risks of data collection and use. Children are also more socially vulnerable and impulsive than adults, which can lead to risky behavior. Children are less likely to be able to resist peer pressure, influence from adults, and marketing than adults. Children are also particularly vulnerable to dark patterns, which are design choices on websites that influence an individual to behave a certain way. Relatedly, children are often experiencing things for the first time and are less likely to be aware of social norms and may be more trusting than adults. And finally, children can suffer more acute privacy harms than adults. If their identity is stolen, it is less likely to be discovered until adulthood when they apply for a credit card, an apartment, or maybe even a mortgage. Rejection from peers or being ostracized hits harder for children, so private information being exposed can be more damaging to their development and feelings. Because of their ongoing brain development, children have difficulty weighing harms that could occur in the future with their actions. And so the idea that a social media post from early adolescence could impact their later ability to go to college or get a job is harder for them to understand. So I just described multiple reasons why children are more vulnerable and maybe in need of additional legal protections, but that lends itself to a multitude of potential risks and harms. This chart from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, an international organization that the US is part of, illustrates many online risks for children, from identity theft to stranger danger to harmful content to online marketing and oversharing. So when looking at child privacy, it is important to be focused and ask, what are you trying to regulate? Being specific about what potential risks or harms you're trying to mitigate or prevent lends itself to a more targeted bill and one that is more likely to achieve whatever that end goal is, as opposed to child privacy generally. So FPF has been working on a subsection of child privacy, student privacy, for many years, and we found that often the key concerns that we hear from parents, advocates, and others boil down into these categories. So commercialization. The majority of child privacy laws and proposals are focused on limiting commercialization. This includes preventing targeted or behavioral advertising to children, limiting or eliminating the ability to sell or share children's data, or other protections aimed at limiting child exposure to marketing and protecting data from being used in inappropriate ways by companies. Another frequent concern is preventing access by children to age-inappropriate content, such as pornography, inappropriate language, access to products such as tobacco or alcohol, or other offensive content. Of course, what is considered inappropriate in one community versus another can vary dramatically, and norms of what is appropriate can change with the times. Physical safety, which I often refer to as stranger danger, is a major issue that comes up and a major thrust of a lot of the early child privacy legislation in the early days of the internet. Child safety is often conflated with child privacy, especially in the older child privacy bills, and there are often restrictions to attempt to prevent any strangers from contacting or chatting with kids, discovering where kids live or go to school, and avoiding children's overly trusting nature from being taken advantage of in a way that may lead to physical or emotional harm. Loss of opportunity often comes up in more relevant conversations as a risk that parents are quite concerned about. As mentioned, when children post things online or when information is collected about them, parents fear that that information may be used to their child's detriment in the future, preventing them from having a successful life through higher education, getting a job, all of the things that, say, an inappropriate social media post might prevent them from. Similarly, there is a harm not only when students lose economic opportunities, but also harms that can affect their social life when peers or other persons are told or learn information about a child that harms their social standing, causing, for example, bullying or stigmatization. We've also heard from policymakers and advocates a lot recently about the fear of surveillance acculturation, particularly as schools adopt more and more technological measures that include elements of surveillance, such as facial recognition or internet scanning. Is our society making students accustomed to overreach in their day-to-day lives, undermining their ability to perhaps learn, to feel free to express themselves, as well as their willingness to make mistakes, because everything they may feel like they may be watched or measured by a technological big brother. This reasoning has been behind suggested moratoriums, for example, on certain technologies in schools. Finally, we often hear concerns about screen time and the possibility that children may become addicted. And I'm using that term not in a medical way, since many, many researchers and doctors have pushed back on it being used in this context, but because policymakers may see it come up in articles and in concerns from constituents. This potential risk tends to be less about privacy specifically and more about child well-being, with policymakers trying to balance how we avoid micromanaging parental choices while ensuring that technology that was built often to keep users coming back and playing longer on games doesn't harm or inhibit children's lives. Now that I've laid out these very different potential risks and harms, let's dive into which of them existing and proposed laws actively regulate, starting with US approaches. So there are multiple US laws that govern child privacy. Let's start with the most well-known law, COPPA. So COPPA focuses on three of the risks previously discussed: commercialization, trying to ensure age-appropriate content, and trying to avoid social or economic consequences for children by allowing parents to delete things from the internet. So COPPA is a law dealing with how websites, apps, and other online operators collect data and personal information from kids under the age of 13. COPPA was passed in 1998, went into effect in 2000, in response to growing use of the internet. The law's drafters were concerned that children using the internet could have their information used without the knowledge or consent of their parents. It has two main functions. It requires businesses that collect information from a child to receive verifiable parental consent prior to collecting the child's personal information. And it requires businesses to allow parents to access and delete any personal information that the business has pertaining to the child. There are several important limits to the protections of the law, however. First, COPPA only applies when a business either has actual knowledge that a specific user of their website is a child, or when the business provides services that are directed at children. In practice, whether a business has actual knowledge or is directing services at children depends on the relevant circumstances. Further, COPPA's protections only apply to children under the age of 13. Under current law, a child who is 13 years of age or older does not fall under COPPA. COPPA is enforced by the Federal Trade Commission and is well known as an area of active enforcement by the Commission. Going back to that list of US laws impacting children that I showed just a minute ago, I want to just very briefly touch on these other regimes. So you have the Children's Internet Protection Act, which is aimed at trying to avoid children gaining access to age-inappropriate content. You have the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, which deals with student privacy. The Protection of People Rights Amendment, PPRA, which restricts surveys that can be given in schools that ask about certain intrusive areas, such as what is happening in a student's home, their sexuality, their religious or political practices. California passed back in 2013 an eraser button law, which enabled parents and children to go back to companies and request that certain information be deleted from their accounts before that was a widely available right. And you have various other state laws. It's worth noting that all of this is up for discussion right now. There are multiple COPPA amendments and other federal bills that are pending, including one that just dropped yesterday. I won't discuss these right now. I think they're going to be touched on a little bit by Tyler, but just know that this is very much so an evolving space in the US. So in CIPA, I mentioned it's about filtering and monitoring. So you have the risks of age-inappropriate content and physical safety being addressed. In FERPA, there's a big focus on limiting commercialization and sharing of information and preventing that future loss of opportunity. In PPRA, again, preventing surveys with age-inappropriate content or that may cause a social detriment by sharing certain sensitive information about children with teachers or their classmates. In the California eraser button law, sort of focusing on more of those risks from the surveillance acculturation to commercialization, loss of opportunity. And then there's something that we haven't talked about yet. We've had an incredibly active legislative landscape in student privacy over the past 6 years, with 40 states and DC passing well over now 130 laws since 2013, with all 50 states introducing a student privacy law, with well over 1,000 bills introduced in this area. So even though there hasn't been specific movement on most child privacy regulation broadly, you have seen a very active landscape that extends protections to all kids in K-12 schools, since they spend a significant portion of their day in schools, and legislators have wanted to make sure that they have adequate protections. So with that, I am now going to turn things over to Tyler Park so he can talk about what states are looking at when it comes to child privacy.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. I really appreciate that. So Amelia has done a really good job of laying out what the landscape is currently today. What I want to go through is some of the things that are a little bit more recent and a little bit more kind of on the horizon so that we have a chance to talk them through. So in the last 2 years, lawmakers at the state and federal level have introduced privacy laws that feature additional protections for children. The California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA, is currently one of the leading child privacy laws in the United States. The law, which passed in 2018 and just took effect on January 1st of this year, was passed by the California legislature in response to a ballot initiative in California that was written by consumer advocates. A lot of the motivation behind CCPA was driven by concerns about privacy that were amplified, especially by the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Its main provisions give consumers control and rights with respect to their personal data, including the right to prevent businesses from selling their personal data. It also gives consumers the right to access and delete the data that's held by businesses. Now, the reason that I said California is one of the leading child privacy laws, the reason that it's important is because it created several special protections for consumers that were based on their age. The law created 3 different age brackets for consumers to exercise different rights with respect to the sale of their data. Now, the first bracket is based on is for children who are under the age of 13. Any child under the age of 13 must have opt-in consent from their parent before a business is able to sell their personal information. This requirement is consistent with COPPA, which Amelia just discussed, and is kind of designed to align with COPPA and the protections there. Now, teens are a new category. Teens aged 13 to 15 enjoy a special level of protection as well. They have to opt into the sale of their data before a business is allowed to sell their data. And then finally, any consumer who's 16 or older may opt out of the sale of their data. So the structure of opting in and opting out that's based on a consumer's age allows Californian children to kind of take increasing responsibility for their data as they become adults. It's worth noting here also that CCPA applies the actual knowledge standard from COPPA to businesses with respect to children's ages. That just is in there to make sure that businesses are put on notice that children are of a certain age before applying those rights. It also added language on top of COPPA that says that a business that willfully disregards a child's age has actual knowledge that the child is of a certain age. So this year, advocates in California introduced a ballot initiative named the California Privacy Rights Act of 2020 to update the CCPA. The ballot initiative, which I'm going to refer to as CCPA 2.0, would extend the age-related provisions to the sharing of personal information in addition to sale, which is already in the law. In California, just for background, any initiative that qualifies for the ballot by receiving the required number of signatures goes up for a vote in November in a general election, and if a majority of Californians approve the ballot initiative, it becomes a part of California law. So no matter what happens with CCPA 2.0 this November, California has extended general privacy protections against selling children's data to teens who are older than COPPA, which is why California is kind of a leader on this. So it's worth going into, at a high level, a couple of other trends that we've seen. Other state privacy bills have either followed California's model or adopted an alternative approach. And this alternative approach defines a child as any individual under a certain age, and that varies from bill to bill, and places children's data in a special protected category of data that they've called sensitive data. And what the bills have done is they've taken this sensitive data and it combines children's data and other sort of sensitive types of data like biometrics, medical information, financial data. And then they typically apply a heightened set of requirements with respect to either collecting or selling or transferring that data. So that's another way of approaching children's privacy that's a good one to keep an eye on. It's also good to note that at the federal level, there have been several interesting proposals relating to child privacy. The bill that Amelia mentioned yesterday, the PROTECT Act, that was on a slide earlier, is something that we just took a look at that looks like it would extend the protections of COPPA up to children who are under the age of 16. So it again reaches that number of adding protections for teens. And Senator Roger Wicker, the Republican from Mississippi, recently released, I believe this was back in December, a discussion draft of a general privacy bill that would grant both parents and teens additional control with respect to their children's data. Senator Wicker's draft is something that we paid a lot of attention to, and the bill itself, what it does is it would prohibit covered entities from transferring data to third parties without affirmative express consent if the covered entity has actual knowledge that the individual is less than 16 years of age. Now, I know that's legalese and that's a lot to unpack, but at a high level, what it does is it builds on the foundation of COPPA by requiring companies to collect the consent of teens and not just children under the age of 13 prior to the transfer, and that includes sale of their data. Senator Wicker's bill was kind of interesting because it also allowed parents to stand in and provide consent on behalf of their child, which is not a feature that was in CCPA or some of the other bills that we've seen. So Senator Wicker's draft, it's important because it has a lot of parallels to bills recently introduced by Senate Democrats addressing general privacy. And in December, FPF released a comparison between the leading proposals in the Senate and found that there are actually a lot of commonalities between both sides. So child privacy, if it did make it into a final bill, could end up being something that becomes part of a national privacy law. This seems politically most likely that the bill could move, but we're kind of, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves and say that this is or isn't something that's going to happen. Obviously, we don't know what will happen, but the trend that we've identified across all of these new privacy proposals seems to be that of extending some sort of additional protections to children who are older than 13. The proposals focus on giving these teens tools to exercise more control over when their data is sold, shared, or transferred than average adult consumers.
So next, we're going to dive into some international approaches as companies that are global apply the privacy protections of European and other countries' laws. The child-specific protections in each of those bills are going to have major implications for what is automatically adopted in companies in the US, as well as protections that legislators may want to borrow from other countries. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jasmine Park to talk about those types of protections.
Thanks, Amelia. So as Amelia mentioned, the US is not alone in its attempts to provide child-specific privacy protections. So looking at the EU, prior to the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, all EU citizens, including children, were protected by the Data Protection Directive that was adopted in 1995. However, when drafting the GDPR, discussions emphasize that children merit specific protections as they may be less aware of the risks, consequences, and safeguards concerned and their rights in relation to the processing of their personal data. Child-specific protections in the GDPR include requiring verifiable parental consent for processing personal data of children under the ages of 13 to 16, depending on the member state. The default is 16, but member states have the option to lower the age up to the lower limit of 13. Child-friendly language for notices provided to children, particular attention to the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten, prohibiting solely automated decision-making using children's data, and providing that children's rights and freedoms override data controllers' interests when there is a conflict. Member states have further clarified and provide additional protections for children. Under the Irish Data Protection Act, it's prohibited to process personal information for children under the age of 18 for direct marketing, profiling, or micro-targeting purposes. The UK's ICO has also submitted its age-appropriate design code of practice to Parliament in November of last year, which provides a guide for online services to be designed based on the ages and needs of their users. It outlines 16 standards, including providing high privacy settings by default, prohibiting nudging children to make choices that compromise their privacy, so this going back to the dark patterns that Amelia mentioned earlier, and providing children with obvious signs when they are being monitored by their parents. There are some principles created by the UN and OECD that also provide the foundation for most individual countries' child privacy laws. According to the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, principles on children's online privacy and freedom of expression, children have the right to privacy and protection of their personal data, the right to freedom of expression and access to information from a diversity of sources, and these rights should be protected and respected in accordance with their evolving capacities. Children also have the right to access remedies for violations and abuses of their rights to privacy and free expression. The OECD also considered emerging online risks for children and recommended a set of principles in 2012, ensuring policies that empower children and parents to evaluate and minimize risks that are proportionate to the risks and not restrict the opportunities and benefits of online engagement for children, that are consistent with other economic and social internet policies, that uphold fundamental democratic values of freedom of expression, privacy protection, and the free flow of information, and that accommodate developmental differences and special vulnerabilities. Other countries have enacted legislation addressing specific problems such as cyberbullying or game addiction. In 2011, the South Korean government passed the Youth Protection Revision Act, also known as the Shutdown Law or Cinderella Law, requiring parental consent for children under the age of 16 to access gaming websites and prohibiting playing internet games between midnight and 6 a.m. Due to public backlash, however, the law was amended in 2016, allowing parents to exempt their children from the gaming curfew. So now I'm going to give things back to Amelia to talk about considerations for legislative drafting.
Thank you so much to Tyler and Jasmine. So we've laid out a lot of what already exists, and hopefully you guys have started submitting some questions, which we'll respond to after this section. We want to make sure that you see all of these things as potential options, but there are also some high-level trends and other things that you can take away before we turn it over to Q&A. So I've talked about sort of this risk framework, the different risks and harms that are addressed in laws that have passed or proposed laws. As you can see, it's kind of all over the map with a big focus on commercialization as the primary risk that most countries, that most states have chosen to focus in on. But I also want to go back in time and talk about what are the limits of regulating child privacy. So going back to COPPA, the reason that COPPA's requirements only apply to websites, apps, and other online operators that are child-directed or have actual knowledge of children on their sites has to do with a previous law called COPPA, or the Child Online Protection Act. COPPA required all commercial distributors of material harmful to minors to restrict their sites from access by minors. The court found that this requirement would likely hinder protected speech by adults. So COPPA was crafted with that criticism of COPPA in mind. And there does exist, and there was a robust debate in the 90s about the tension between crafting a comprehensive child privacy law and protecting the free speech rights of adults, aka not age-gating the internet. As more bills are introduced to update or add on to COPPA, it's important to be aware of the existing case law on the matter and some of the things that will be needed in order to bring balance to this conversation. Passing back to Jasmine, when is consent appropriate?
So there is a consensus that children are a vulnerable population that merits special protections. However, there are different models for segmenting the population and granting child-specific privacy protections. In the US, as Amelia and Tyler mentioned, COPPA uses a notice and consent model under which parents or legal guardians must opt in for the collection of data for children under the age of 13. CCPA also relies on notice and consent mirroring COPPA in requiring parental consent for children under 13, but provides another layer of protection for minors between 13 and 15, giving them opt-in rights for the sale of their data. However, there are other models being discussed and implemented internationally. Age gating, for example, requires age verification prior to accessing a service or website. Signposting segments traffic by providing buttons to direct the user to either a child-friendly or general audience version of the site. Privacy by design means building in privacy at every stage of product development with the effect of making the general audience online space more suitable for children. And designing for age bands means providers develop different versions of their product or service for different age groups, from infancy all the way to adulthood.
Of course, this means that it is very difficult for a general audience company to have basically parallel versions of their website, a child-friendly and a general audience friendly version. And this is something in particular with the UK and their age appropriate design code that we're going to see just how workable it is to, in some cases, potentially require those sorts of parallel sites or acknowledgement that most general audience sites do in fact have children who are using it.
Mm-hmm. There is also a lack of consensus regarding the upper threshold for the age of a child, which currently ranges between 13 and 18 years old. A higher age adopted by the GDPR of 16 and the UK and Ireland of 18 extends protections to teenagers, but raises questions of parental access, deletion, and portability.
To add something there about the parental access question, we also often run into, in the student context, questions about what about when you're dealing with abusive parents? What about when you're dealing with older teens who are accessing materials their parents may not want them to access, whether it is a LGBT forum, a website about sexuality, exploring a new religion or a political topic that their parents may not approve of. And so there are genuine questions about exactly where policymakers may want to draw lines about when a parent is the one who has to or may consent or have access to information versus when that information should pass along to a young adult.
Mm-hmm. A lower age of 13 adopted by COPPA and the lower limit of the GDPR promotes online participation of children and encourages the development of digital media literacy and resilience. So resilience is a concept talked about where children are going to at some point be exposed to content that can be perceived as harmful or obscene on the internet, and how are they being developed? How are we helping them develop the skills to be able to deal with those risks and to be able to consume the general audience internet in a healthy way? So with the increasingly complex landscape of child privacy legislation globally and the rising costs of compliance, online service providers may find it in their best interest to age gate their services. So with an age gate mentioned earlier, children will need to verify that the users, online users will have to verify their age as being over the age of 13, 16, 18, prior to being able to access a website. With an age gate, children either tell the truth about their age and retain their child privacy protections, but lose access to online services, or they can lie about their age and retain access to online services, but lose their child privacy protections. So this is not a choice that we want to give children. We want them to explore all of the riches that the internet has to offer and not have to trade off their child privacy protections for that access. So The differing ages of digital ages of consent further complicates compliance for online service providers operating in several jurisdictions with conflicting ages. Potential workarounds include applying the upper limit of 16 or 18 across the board, having users indicate what country they reside in when accessing a service, or using different domains for different countries.
So our last part of the conversation before we kick things off to Q&A, unintended consequences are something that it is incredibly easy, are incredibly easy to occur when it comes to child privacy. We saw in the student privacy context in states many examples of this, most clearly with school photography and yearbooks. Often states started from a position of banning all sale of student data, period, no exceptions. And then many went back just a little bit because banning the sale of student data, well, student data involves photos. And by banning the sale of student data, you just ban school photography. And so many state legislators who have kids in school and like that lineup of annual pictures rolled back those definitions and added just a tiny bit of nuance there to allow for parental consent for sale in those particular circumstances. They may have tailored the definition to say specifically, this does not mean you school photographers. But this is just one example of the ways of something that seems so straightforward, a particular definition of student data, a particular definition of sale, can, at the end of the day, be really difficult to manage when it comes to crafting a child privacy bill. Another good example, related again to photography, is a requirement that one state wanted to impose that devices that were movable, that held data, should be encrypted. This makes a lot of sense. It was trying to provide or trying to prevent where a hard drive would be stolen potentially or accessed by thieves, and then they would be able to just obtain access if the data on that drive was not encrypted. However, again, personal information, children's personal information includes photographs. And so by requiring that storage mobile containers with personal information on them be encrypted, it cut out the ability to have cameras, since most of those do not have encrypted data for those photographs. So it's very, very interesting and key to do two things. First of all, making sure that there are clear definitions and checking with key stakeholders on the ground, such as children themselves, parents, school superintendents represented by ASA, the School Superintendents Association, attorneys, for example, the Council of School Attorneys, National Center for Youth Law, and other child advocates, and from schools, districts, child welfare organizations. Look broadly to the stakeholders who you're talking to, because schools and homes are very different from how we all grew up as children. And you want to make sure that you're not limiting some aspect of the digital world that can be important.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Amelia. So I'm just a quick side note. I know a lot of folks are typing questions in the chat, and I just wanted to let you know that we're going to address all of them in the Q&A. So if I haven't gotten you an answer yet, apologies. I do want to kind of follow up on what Amelia said about especially clear definitions with kind of a real life example from the California Consumer Privacy Act, which folks out in California have been navigating. So CCPA defines a business, and this is one of the central definitions in the law, and it includes for-profit companies that collect consumer data. And the drafters of the law understood, though, that not every single company is going to have a direct interface with consumers, yet secondary companies might end up with consumer data. So what they did is they created a category for service providers to account for kind of business to business relationships where consumer data was passing hands pursuant to a contract, and in order to facilitate some sort of necessary business relationship. So to kind of flesh that out a little bit, imagine that a social media company where users post personal information contracts with another storage company to use the storage company's servers to store the social media data. In that relationship, the social media company would be the business and the storage company would be the quote unquote service provider under CCPA. However, the definition of service provider in CCPA only included companies that provided services to other businesses. And now an education technology company providing the exact same, let's say, storage services under contract with a school, which is not a business, was not covered in this definition. Therefore, the companies that provided those services to schools were really unsure if the full range of CCPA obligations would apply to them. There was a very real possibility when everyone was first digesting the law that a 16-year-old in a high school could call the education technology company that serviced their school and direct that company to delete their homework, their grades, their attendance records, and it wasn't clear under the law what that company was supposed to do. We heard while we were kind of going back and forth on this that some education companies were considering pulling out of California over the risk that they wouldn't be able to comply with both CCPA and the local student privacy laws that were there in California. So, as a just quick aside, the California Attorney General has proposed draft regulations that would fix that particular kind of drafting quirk in that use case, and that made, I think, people probably feel a lot more at ease in California. But this is the sort of definitional challenge that can come up as a completely unintended consequence of one of these laws. And it's important in the context of child privacy to remember that children's data is collected and used both in the educational context and when children are outside of school, using technology at home or after school. And that can create some challenges crafting language that's really useful that really does match up with student privacy laws. Now, to make things even a little bit more challenging, an important consideration when legislating in the context of children's privacy is to navigate these existing laws, right? So when crafting language, there are several tools available to minimize the intersection of child privacy provisions with existing laws. So one of the things to do is to consider the difference between using data-based or entity-based exemptions. And what that looks like, I'm just going to kind of give an example. In the context of FERPA, exempting data that is covered by the law creates a gap when companies hold FERPA-covered data. And we didn't really get into this, but FERPA is a law that only applies to schools and therefore is, for the most part, unenforceable against companies directly. Those student data held by a company might be covered by FERPA technically. The company itself that's holding the data is not. And so what that means is that companies would be holding student data that is exempt from a privacy law and that is subject to FERPA, but FERPA is not enforceable directly against them. So an exemption to entities covered by FERPA might not be appropriate or might be appropriate depending on what you're trying to do. As an alternative, this is just kind of an illustration of the opposite point. Let's say there was a new privacy bill that exempted child-directed sites, the sites themselves, because they are exclusively covered by COPPA, the federal law that we discussed that protects children. Those entities, the entire entity would be completely exempt from that new privacy law if it was just a total entity exemption. While the children's data that's held by that company would still be covered by COPPA, any non-child data that's held by that company would also be exempted. So that's kind of the difference between exempting the data itself or exempting the entity. And without carefully considering how to craft these exemptions and how to align a new child privacy provision with existing laws, there can be unintended consequences like under-inclusive or over-inclusive laws.
And last but not least, before we get into the questions, preemption. As I said, we've had a number of student privacy laws passed in states, and education is generally a local enterprise. There's a lot of variance in what each state may consider to be the ideal student privacy protections. And preemption is tricky. Our third webinar in this series dealt with that, so I will refer all of you to watch that to see exactly how this might work, but carefully thinking about what you do or do not want to preempt is going to be incredibly important in pulling together any legislation. So just very quickly, some resources and recommended reading. We mentioned the OECD principles that were put out in 2012 on the protection of children online. Those principles are now being reconsidered by the OECD, but it is very much so worth looking back at 2012 to see what is available there. As we mentioned, some of the newest privacy protections are coming from the UK's Information Commissioner Office with the Age Appropriate Design Code. So taking a look at their consultation document may be useful. UNICEF has a helpful industry toolkit just released last year on children's online privacy and freedom of expression. And we also included a link to the South Korean Youth Protection Act, which was mentioned. There are many more resources that we're going to provide, but now we want to go ahead and dive into some questions. So first we want to address, there was a question about Senator Markey's COPPA proposal that came out in March 2018. As previously mentioned, COPPA has an actual knowledge standard. How actual knowledge is defined, not to go too far into the weeds here, has really changed over time. The way it was described to me originally by many is that a company has knowledge that a particular child or a particular group of children is using their platform. How it has evolved, and I think likely where the FTC may be going with this, is that a company generally has knowledge that children are on the platform. They may not know that John or Jane Doe is on the platform, but they do know that there are children. And we saw in the recent YouTube settlement, for example, the FTC noting that YouTube was telling potential advertisers that there were children on the platform that they could reach. So that has changed just within existing law, not even touching on any of the future proposals. What Senator Markey proposed last year was changing this actual knowledge standard to a constructive knowledge standard. So you should know that there are children on your platform. We've also seen options that look at something between the two, where you reasonably should know that there are children on your platform. And the Age Appropriate Design Code we mentioned really operates from a there are children on your platform perspective, citing the fact that a third of internet users in one study are found to be children. They are pushing for a presumption that there are children on the platform. So all of these are potential options for policymakers weighing what standard companies should be held to, with of course a lot of concerns about companies being company legislation potentially being overbroad, where they have to just assume that because they may have content that is attractive to children, that children will be on their website, and therefore you run into some of the free speech concerns that I mentioned came up in debates in the 90s. So next question we'll go into, is there any case law or guidance that would suggest that pseudonymization is treated differently when it pertains to children's data? So I'm not going to go too far in the weeds. We have limited time, and de-identification and aggregation, pseudonymization when it comes to kids' data varies by law, but I would say generally the approach has been in most laws and in most proposals that de-identified and aggregated information is not personally identifiable when it's properly de-identified, and that it can be used for anything, whether it be product improvement, whether it be research, whether it be general sale data, as long as it cannot as long as it is not considered personal information in most of the laws that are out there, it is available to be used. This varies a bit when you start talking about European law. There's been a lot of questions about whether consent up front will allow for research later. But generally in the US, once you get to a point that the information is can no longer be traced back to a specific person, de-identified, pseudonymized, aggregated data can, at least under most current laws, be used for any purpose. Let me see, next question. So are there other differences companies should keep in mind when tailoring their CCPA or GDPR data protection strategy with regards to children, regarding things like age of consent, possibly pseudonymization? My impression would be that you should assume an age of consent of 16 most of the time. It is going to get tricky when it comes to de-identification. Definitely not something we can dig into right now, but we'll include in follow-up resources after this. FPF released a comparison of CCPA and GDPR, and we're happy to send that out, and you can take a look at the strategies in regards to kids. So what practical impact is the CCPA's introduction of the willful blindness or disregard principle likely to have? I think Tyler has some thoughts, but at least for me, I've often heard complaints from advocates that you end up with COPPA as actual knowledge standard, with companies proactively sticking their heads in the sand when it comes to potential children on their platform. So my bet is that it rolls back people who are very much so trying not to know about kids on their platform. But Tyler, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth keeping a couple of things in mind with this. One, yeah, I think Amelia really hit the nail on the head with how the language will kind of change things. It's worth being aware that the Attorney General has said that they're going to hold off on enforcing CCPA for at least the next 6 months or so, until next summer. So we don't really know the practical impacts yet, because a certain amount of it depends on how it's enforced, and maybe 5 or 10 years in the future, looking back, we'll be able to say, okay, well, the case law says X, Y, or Z, but we don't quite know that yet. So we're kind of keeping our eyes peeled. But this, combined with the increase in age from 13 to 15 or so, at which companies have to be aware of and provide special rights to children, is likely to really shift the needle in terms of companies being able to just kind of throw up their hands and say that they don't know how old someone is. It's gonna, I think, probably have some impact, but we don't know exactly what the impact will be yet.
Fantastic. So 5 more minutes for questions. We have a few more, but just want to encourage anyone who hasn't entered their question into the chat box so far to go ahead and do that. You can also feel free, our contact information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out to us. We'll do our best to answer your question or connect you to someone who can. So another question, why does emerging US legislation seem to focus on selling or sharing data and not also on the use of children's data by those who have collected it? My impression is that this is just following how the US has approached privacy over time. We've been very much so focused on that sort of like selling or sharing, and the commercialization potential risk that I mentioned has overwhelmingly been the top thing that I think has been focused on by privacy advocates, which leads to that being the most common provision that tends to be seen. However, use of children's data is something that's been addressed a bit in the school context. And you do see it outside of that as well, but it's often done very broadly. So for example, a lot of companies are restricted by law for using data they obtain through their work with a school for any non-educational purpose. They have to use it for an educational purpose. Sometimes that is defined in law, sometimes it is not. Tends to be a fairly broad restriction, in part to provide that local control I mentioned that's so important in the US, but in part because it's not always clear what uses we want folks to have. Some states have gotten around that by focusing their regulation or use limitations or allowances as something that regulators, so not the legislature itself, but perhaps a Department of Education or others can utilize. But it is very tricky. I think with CCPA, we are seeing more of an appetite in the US for use limitations, so likely to move forward. Just a couple minutes left. Let's see, with all of the data breaches and the data that are out there, studies have been done that de-identified data can be re-identified with a fairly high percentage rate by merging data from several data breaches. Thoughts? Yes. it is, yes. So this is the tricky thing, and something that makes me, I think, a little less frightened about de-identified data being shared or being allowed to be shared under several of these laws. De-identified data doesn't mean de-identified data, or it doesn't mean data where you've taken out the names or data where you've taken out the student ID number or something else. It means genuinely de-identified data that either makes it incredibly hard to trace back to a particular individual. There are some experts in this field who I think could trace back anyone. But you have, for example, in the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA, you have a part of the definition of personally identifiable information, a catch-all if a reasonable person in a school community would be able to identify that person with reasonable certainty, then that counts as personal data. It doesn't matter if you're calling it de-identified. And I think that we've seen at the FTC, will likely see in the future, an appetite to go after companies or others that have said that they have de-identified information, but in fact that information is easily re-identifiable just by itself, not even counting when you combine it with other available sources out there. And I think we are seeing more and more of a trend of when information is put out, it is much more likely to be put out now in an aggregated format that is harder to trace back to particular individuals, as opposed to a de-identified data set. But this is still moving, and as computers get more powerful, it will get easier to trace back, which is why you see so many changes right now with the US Census Bureau shifting how they are going to be disclosing census results to make sure that that data cannot be traced back to particular individuals. So with that, we are unfortunately at the end of time. As mentioned, please feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is on the screen with future questions. And we really appreciate all of you attending this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you come back to our next webinar in the legislative series. Keep an eye on the URL, fpf.org/legislative-resources. The resources that we mentioned will be posted on the page, as well as the recording of this webinar. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.